everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on the ontological argument for God's existence. So before we can actually fully understand this argument, we need to draw several distinctions. So the first distinction we need to think about is the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori. So a priori is a form of knowledge that you can accrue independently of experience. And by contrast, a posteriori is a kind of knowledge that you can accrue through experience or as a result of experience. So, for example, the truth that Venus is identical to itself is a necessary truth, right? And it is acquired by a priori reasoning, right? Like you don't need to go out into the world to know that Venus is identical to itself. Like once you know that Venus exists, then you don't need to verify with your telescope that indeed Venus is actually identical to Venus. By contrast, consider the phrase or the identity phosphorus is identical to Hesperus. Now, phosphorus was the name of the morning star according to the ancients. So whenever they saw the morning star, they saw phosphorus. And whenever they saw the evening star, they called it Hesperus. So the morning star was called phosphorus and the evening star was called Hesperus. Now, little did the ancients know that actually phosphorus was Venus, and so was actually Hesperus. They just didn't know that Venus showed up in the morning and the same exact star showed up in the evening. They thought it was two different stars. And so in that sense, it is true that phosphorus is identical to Hesperus, right? But it is an a posteriori truth, right? It's something that the ancients had to learn as a result of their experience, and or more likely we came to understand later once we had the proper tools to understand that it's actually Venus. But notice that both of these propositions are necessarily true, right? Because they're identities. Remember from our prior lecture that all identities are necessary, right? If something's identical to something else, then it's identical in every possible world. And so the distinction between a priori and a posteriori is not a distinction between the necessary and the contingent, which is a distinction we talked about in our previous lecture. It cuts across, right? Some truths are a priori and necessary, but some necessary truths are also a posteriori. Okay? And Clark Kent, another maybe fun example. So Clark Kent is identical to Superman. It's a necessary truth, but of course it's a posteriori, right? There's no chance that Lois Lane could have sat down in her armchair and reasoned from the concept of Clark Kent to the concept of Superman. She needed some sort of experience to tell her that they're identical, right? Maybe some experience of Clark Kent ripping his shirt open and having Superman underneath, right? That's the type of a posteriori experience that Lois Lane needed to know to find this out. So it's a posteriori. What about 2 plus 2 equals 4? Is it known a priori, that is independently of experience, or a posteriori? Well, it is known a priori, right? By understanding the concept of 2 and addition, and we get the understanding that that's just 4. So it's a priori, right? Most mathematics is like that, including something even complex as 345 times 567, whatever number that is, even though it's not as easy or intuitive to see what the answer is as 2 plus 2 equals 4. Nevertheless, even though this is a much longer chain of reasoning, it's still a priori. All right, so with respect to the arguments that we've discussed so far in our class, first we have the argument from design. And so it's useful for us to ask, is this argument a priori argument or a posteriori argument? Well, it seems like it would be a posteriori. Why? Because it's based on an observation or an experience. what is the experience or observation of? The experience that things appear to be designed, right? Like a watch. And based on that observation of the eye and biological complexity, we infer that the argument goes that we should infer that there's a designer, but that argument therefore is a posteriori. What about the cosmological argument? A little bit more complicated, and it depends on the kind of cosmological argument. The one that we considered was the classical version, and that one likewise relied on an observation of objects, right? Remember, they are these dependent objects like chairs and pens and so on and so forth. And it seems like these objects didn't have to exist, right? And so based on that observation, it seems like then we can, of course, the principle of sufficient reason is supposed to be a priori, but it ultimately does rest on experience. By contrast, the ontological argument, which we'll discuss today, is entirely a priori. And so we will be engaging in an argument that does not rely on any kind of experience or observational data of any sort. Okay, here are a few more distinctions that we need. They are actual things, that is, these are things that exist in reality, such as you, me, and the chair behind me, and so on and so forth. But within these actual things, and we already talked about this last class, they are contingent things, that is, things that exist in the actual world, right? So they're actual things, but they didn't have to exist, right? It's possible that they could have not existed, right? Such as you and me. It's possible that we could have failed to exist, and so we are contingent things. But then there are also necessary things. These are things that are not contingent. These are things that necessarily exist or exist in every possible world, such as numbers, right? Numbers seem to be the kinds of things that are necessary, and if God exists, then God will be also a necessary thing, a thing that exists in every possible world. Great. Then we have the distinction about possible things. And possible things, as you may think, are things that possibly exist. So, for example, it's possible that there could have been a 100-foot book, if you remember from our previous example about conceivability and possibility, right? So it's possible. And so a 100-foot tall book is in principle possible, but it's not actual, right? So there are some things that are possible, obviously, which are not actual. But for our purposes, all actual things are actually also possible. So even though I'm an actual thing, I'm also a possible thing. And you might ask, why is that the case? Well, the basic idea is that for things to be possible, they just need to exist in a possible world, right? And it so happens that if you exist in the actual world, then you exist in a possible world, right? And so by that definition, you are actual things are also possible things, right? Because actual things are more robust, right? And so if they're actual, then of course they're possible. But then there are these impossible things. So what are some impossible things? And again, we kind of have come across this idea before in our discussion of dualism. What are some impossible things? Well, square circles are impossible things. Triangles, right triangles that fail to have the Pythagorean theorem properties, right? Those are impossible things. They don't exist. Right triangles the square of the two sides are not equal to the square of the hypotenuse is not possible, right? Also, a table whose surface is entirely orange or blue is not a possible object, right? So there's a lot of impossible things that cannot exist. All right. One more distinction before we jump into the argument, and this is Anselm's distinction between existence in understanding and existence in reality. And I think this is a pretty intuitive distinction, right? So there are things that exist in reality, and we can call those things actual things, right? Like, for example, things like the chair, again, you, me, and so on. But, there's also, it includes both contingent beings and necessary beings. That's fine. But then there's this idea about existence in the understanding. And these are just possible things that could exist, right? So in a sense, we have actually already drawn this distinction, but Anselm draws it in using this language of existence in reality and existence in understanding. All right. Now for Anselm, let's back up. So consider an example of existence in understanding. And one example which Anselm gives is the fountain of youth. And what is the fountain of youth? Well, the fountain of youth is apparently this fountain that people can drink from, and it preserves their youth, right? You don't age and you don't die in uncertain iterations of that myth. And the fountain of youth possibly exists, right? There's nothing contradictory about that thought of a fountain of youth existing. Again, sometimes it helps to just think God in principle could have created a fountain of youth. In fact, now that I think about it, the Garden of Eden was sort of like a fountain of youth, actually, right? Because when God expels Adam and Eve from the garden, part of the reason is that so that they don't live forever. And so the assumption seems to be that if had they stayed in the garden and eaten of its fruits, they would just have lived forever. So yeah, so in that sense, if you are already inclined to believe in God, then that's an example to think about how, yeah, of course it's possible. Again, in the metaphysical sense. According to Anselm, then, the fountain of youth exists in the understanding, but not in reality, right? So the fountain of youth, as a matter of fact, does not exist. But, interestingly enough, when you say the fountain of youth does not exist, according to Anselm, that for you to be able to say that, for us to be able to say the fountain of youth does not exist, it has to exist in our understanding. Because there's an intelligible concept of the fountain of youth, which exists in our understanding, and we're saying that does not exist in reality. So for us to be able to say that the fountain of youth does not exist, it has to exist in reality. Sorry, it has to exist in our understanding. This is going to actually become pretty important, as I will highlight once we get to the argument. All right, so we have these distinctions. We need one more before we jump into this argument, and this is the argument about the concept of God. According to Anselm, we need a precise definition of God, and you might think that this should be it. That is, that our concept of God should be a being that which no existing being is greater. But Anselm doesn't think this is a good definition, right? And why is that? Well, this just says that God is the greatest existing being, right? A being that which no existing being is greater just means that God is the greatest existing being. But that is not a good definition, because suppose God doesn't exist, right? Then what's the greatest existing being? Well, let's assume the humans have the most value out of all of the animal kingdom. Well, if we exist and the animals exist, and what it means to be God is the greatest existing being, then we would be God. Humans would be God. And that doesn't seem to be a good concept of God. So Anselm does not think that we should actually have this definition for God. Instead, we should expand the range of considerations here and think about God as a being than which no conceivable being is greater. Conceivability. So in terms of possibility, that being than which none greater is possible. God is not the greatest existing being, but the greatest possible being. And that, according to Anselm, makes much more sense. And in fact, one would argue that, yeah, even atheists would agree with this definition of God. They just don't believe that anybody satisfies that description because they don't believe God exists. But they can say, yes, that's a more accurate definition of God, and I don't believe that exists. And so, again, this is just laying out the work before the argument gets started. Okay, so by God, then, we're going to mean that being which none greater is possible. And the goal of the argument, then, of the ontological argument, is to establish that number 3 exists in reality, so that there is an actual being than which none greater is possible, and they exist in reality. All right, so now we're ready. Actually, we're not ready yet, because if you see our definition of God, it has this interesting element, which is greater, right? So we're defining God in terms of the concept of greatness. And so in order for us to finish defining God, we need a definition of greater. So according to Anselm, with our concept of greatness, so there are properties, which things have that make them great. And the more they have of it, the greater it makes them better. And he contrasts the property of being wise with the property of size. The more that a person has the property of wisdom, that is, the more wise they are, the better and greater they are, right? Unlike size, the bigger someone is, right, the less great. It doesn't make a difference, actually. Sorry, I was going to say not the less great, but just it doesn't seem to make a difference to their being better or great. Anselm also talks about moral goodness. So again, the more moral goodness something has, a particular action, the better it is. Virtue, the more virtuous a person is, the better it is, the greater it is. So this is the sense of greatness that Anselm has in mind. And here is a fundamental point in this argument, and that's that existence in reality is a great-making feature, much like wisdom or moral goodness or virtue. So wisdom, moral goodness, and virtue are great-making features. That is, individuals that have them makes them great. And he thinks existence in reality is a great-making feature. That is, it is better for things to exist in reality than they are to merely exist in the understanding, right? And that makes sense if you think about it, right? You can conceive right now of having $1 million, right? Just think about it right now. Think about you having a bag with $1 million. So that bag of money exists in your understanding right now. Well, it's better if it existed in reality, right? Much, much better, much greater. So the existence, that bag of money would be much greater if it existed in reality, right? So that's essentially his point. All right, so let's jump into the argument. And so this is the way we're going to remember. So remember that by God, we mean that being which none greater is possible. But I don't want to embed that full sentence into the argument because it make the premises so long. So I'm going to have the term God, but we have to remember that by God, we just mean this phrase, that being which none is greater is possible. All right. So here's the first premise. God exists in the understanding. Is it true or false? It's hard to deny that this is false, to be honest. In fact, an atheist should say that, for an atheist to say, I don't believe in God, that thing which they're saying, I don't believe in, has to exist in their understanding. If you remember, this is the point about the fountain of youth. When somebody says the fountain of youth does not exist in reality, well, it has to exist in your understanding, because otherwise how can you say it doesn't exist in reality? You have to understand it, and it exists as a concept in your mind before you can say that it does not exist in reality. So God existing in understanding has to be a premise that even the atheist has to accept. Otherwise, the atheist cannot intelligibly say that God does not exist. So premise one is pretty bulletproof. Premise number two, God might have existed in reality. That is, God is a possible being. Again, this one seems very hard to resist, because what would the denial of this premise look like? Somebody who denied this premise would not merely be arguing that God does not exist. No, this is saying God is a possible being. Somebody who denied this premise would be saying that it's impossible for God to exist. That God is an impossible being, right? That is like a square circle, something that literally cannot exist by the laws of logic or metaphysics. And that is far too strong of a claim. I think most atheists, quite frankly, believe that God doesn't exist in the same way that unicorns don't exist. That's what they mean. They do not mean the denial of number two, but in the same way that unicorns possibly exist, right? Also, it's possible that God exists. So far, these are pretty bulletproof. Number three, And this really, again, is actually just follows from number 1 and number 2 and the definition of God. So all of this is pretty safe and bulletproof, but let's go over it together. So what is number 3 saying? Number 3 is saying that if God exists in the understanding and might have existed in reality, again, so if God exists in the understanding, so if premise 1, and might have existed in reality, and if premise 2, then it, that is God, might have been greater than it is. It's just possible that God could have been greater. Why? Because remember his previous point. To exist in the understanding, or rather, to exist in reality, it's better than to exist in the understanding. Remember the bag of money. It's better that this bag of money is real than not, right? And so, all of this is saying is that God might have existed in reality, right? And so it's possible that God could have been greater because he right now we're only supposing that he exists in the understanding. So since he only exists in the understanding, it might have been better for God he would have been better had he existed in reality. Again, even the fountain of youth could be the case. The fountain of youth only exists in understanding, but it might have been better had it existed in real life. Same with the bag of money. That bag of money exists in my understanding, but it might have been better that it existed in reality. Same with God. God exists in the understanding, but it might have been better had he existed in reality. That's all this is saying, and so far is pretty bulletproof. But here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and both philosophically but also argumentatively, because Anselm is going to introduce a particular form of reasoning here embedded within this argument that it's called an indirect argument, or a reductio ad absurdum. And an indirect argument or a reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum just means it's in Latin for reduced to absurdity or to absurdity. But when we mean an indirect argument, we mean that it's a particular kind of argument that aims to show the truth of something by showing that its opposite leads to a contradiction or an absurdity. So let me just give you the schema here. So the way that this argument works, and this argument is used in mathematics and other branches, especially in mathematical branches. But the way this argument works is premise number 1 is assume that P is true. Okay? And we'll go over an example in a second. So assume that P is true. If you can show by premise 2, by deriving from P, that you can derive that Q is the case and that not Q is the case, that means if you can show that P leads to a contradiction, then you can infer that therefore not P is the case. So again, if you can start with P and you can show that it leads to a contradiction, both that Q is true and that not Q is true, therefore you can infer that not P is the case. Here's an example. Suppose that 1 plus 1, it's not 2 is true. Again, we know that that's false, but this is the way we're going to show how you would prove this. How would you prove to your little cousin who refuses to believe that 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? So this is the way you do it. Okay, assume that 1 plus 1 is not 2. So assume that that's true. Okay? Well, by definition, 1 is the successor of 0. That's just what we mean by 1, right? That it comes after 0 in the ordering line. By 2, we mean is a successor of 1. That's just what we mean by 2, right? And when we say the phrase x plus 1 in mathematics means the successor of x. That's just what we mean by that. But if that's the case, then it follows that 1 plus 1 equals the successor of 1, right? By this definition and this, which equals 2. But we had just supposed that 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. And now we got to the conclusion that 1 plus 1 equals 2. So that is a contradiction. Therefore, 1 plus 1 must equal 2. So again, we suppose something to be the case. We show that that supposition led to a contradiction, and therefore we can infer the opposite of what we assumed. the falsity of what we assumed. And that's what the kind of role which premise 4 is going to play in Anselm's argument. So let's go back to the main argument. So remember, these are the premises that we already discussed. God exists in the understanding. Premise 2, God might have existed in reality. That is, God is a possible being. And if God exists in the understanding and might have existed in reality, then it might have been greater than it is. Right? Again, nothing controversial here. It's all pretty bulletproof. Here comes the indirect argument embedded within this oral argument. And so Anselm says, well, suppose, again, for the purpose of an indirect argument, that God exists only in the understanding. So this supposition is the same kind of supposition like the one we just discussed, where we're supposing that 1 plus 1 is not 2. This is what Anselm's doing. He's supposing something because he wants to derive the opposite. He's going to show that this opposition leads to a contradiction, and therefore 4 is false. But what does it mean for 4 to be false? Because 4 says God exists only in understanding. Well, if that's false, that means that it's not the case that God exists only in understanding, which is to say that God must exist in reality, right? So that's the way we're headed. So let's take it slowly. So again, suppose God exists only in the understanding and not in reality, right? Well, it follows from 2, 3, and 4 together that God might have been greater than he is, right? Because remember, we know from 3 that if God exists only in the understanding, but it's possible that he could have existed in reality, then it's possible God might have been greater than he in fact is, because we're supposing by 4 that he only exists in the understanding. So he only exists in the understanding, but it's possible that he might have existed in reality, and therefore God might have been greater than he in fact is. But the problem with that, or actually before we get to the problem, just to precisify, from that it follows that God, because we're supposing that God only exists in the understanding, therefore God is a being than which a greater is possible. That is, God is such that there is a being, there's somebody better than God, because there's this being that could possibly exist in reality. It's possible, right? Because we're supposing by 4 that God only exists in the understanding. But the problem with that is that leads to a contradiction once we just embed the definition of God here. So let's take this definition out, or rather, let's take God out and put the definition which Anselm gave us. Remember, that being that which nothing greater could exist. And we end up with that being, so all we're doing is substituting God here with the definition of God, and we're leaving everything the same. And what we end up with is that being than which none greater is possible, that's the definition, is a being than which a greater is possible. Because this part of the argument we got from 5. And what is this? So that being than which none greater is possible is a being than which a greater is possible? That's a contradiction, right? That is saying that there's this greatest possible being, but in fact, he's not the greatest possible being because there's another one, someone greater. That is a contradiction as much as 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. So therefore, 4 is false, right? Remember, once you show that a supposition leads to a contradiction, you can suppose that 4 is false in the same way that in our previous example, once we showed that 1 plus 1 does not equal 2 leads to a contradiction, we can infer the opposite, namely that 1 plus 1 does equal 2, right? And since 4 is false, therefore, God exists. So what does 4 say? Suppose God exists only in the understanding, right? Well, in that case, that's false. And so God cannot only exist in the understanding, he must also exist in reality as well. So that's the argument. All right. Now, there is one famous objection by a fellow monk by the name of Ganilo, who wrote to Anselm a letter titled On Behalf of the Fool, Why is it titled On Behalf of the Fool? Because Anselm thought that only a fool could fail to believe in God. And in fact, he took that from one of the Psalms, which says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, right? That really was one of the inspirations for Anselm. How can the scriptures in the Psalms say the fool says in his heart, there is no God? And so only a fool could fail to believe in God, right? And so that's why he comes up with this irrefutable argument in Anselm's own mind. And so Ganilo writes back with a letter saying, on behalf of the fool. And what's kind of neat, or I would say, is that Ganilo essentially tries to do like his form of argumentation or his form of criticism of Anselm is that he tries to do a reductio ad absurdum on Anselm's overall argument. So he tries to do an indirect argument on Anselm's indirect argument, right? So what does that look like? Well, what he wants to show is that the kind of reasoning that Anselm uses to establish his argument actually leads to absurdity or a contradiction, and therefore that form of reasoning cannot possibly be right. So he's using the same sort of argumentative strategy, as it were, to criticize Anselm. And this is his example. So he says, look, Anselm, suppose that island in which none greater is possible. Okay? That's my definition of the greatest possible island. Okay? Now, number 2 is what you said, Anselm, right? That it's greater to exist than not to exist. Or to be more precise, that it's greater to exist in the understanding than to exist only in reality, right? Or sorry, it's better. Sorry, my apology. It's greater to exist in reality and not merely in the understanding. Okay, so far, so good. Right, Anselm? Well, Anselm, if the island in which none is greater is possible doesn't exist, because we're just going to suppose, right, that the greatest possible island doesn't exist, right? Then there's an island than which a greater is possible, right? So if we suppose that the island than which none greater is possible, the greatest possible island only exists in our understanding, right? Right? But not in reality, right? But then the island in our minds is not the greatest island, because it might have been better had it actually existed. Same idea as the money, right? And if that's the case, then that leads to an absurdity, according to Ganilo, because it's impossible for the greatest island, or the island than which none greater is possible, to be an island than which a greater is possible. So how can the island in my mind be the greatest possible island and at the same time not be, right? So that is but that's absurd, because this would seem to establish, therefore, the greatest island actually exists. The island in which none greater is possible must exist, right? And that's absurd, because you can run this argument with the greatest everything, the greatest shoe, the greatest money bag, the greatest apple, right? That's the point that Ganilo is showing. Your argument is your reasoning, this kind of reasoning, from the greatest, and then the distinction between being better in reality than in your understanding, leads to all these absurd arguments, and therefore your original argument is wrong. Now, Rowe, I think, correctly identifies a problem with this objection, and it really comes down to the understanding of existence being a great-making property. Because by Anselm, the existing great property just means that if something does not exist, then it is not as a great a thing as it would have been had it existed, right? If something does not exist, then it is not as a great thing as it would have had it existed, right? That's all that the existing says. But this implies that if Ganilo's island does not exist, which it doesn't, then the island than which none greater is possible is an island than which a greater thing is possible. So all of this implies is that something greater than Ganilo's island possibly exists. And that is not contradictory, right? Because again, you can suppose that other things are better. So this is not a contradiction. For example, again, maybe this is not plausible, but the point is that it's not a contradiction. All of this is consistent with saying that a perfect man may be a greater thing than a perfect island. But that is not a contradiction, right? There's something that could have existed that is better than the island. And that is not a contradiction, because maybe a perfect man is better than an island or a continent or a country. But that does not apply to God, because God, by definition, is the greatest being. So that's why it's a contradiction in the case of God, but not in the case of an island, or in the case of money, or in the case of an apple. Because all of that saying that something greater might have existed. But for God, that cannot be the case, because God, by definition, is the greatest being. So that's the way that this objection gets answered, I think, quite adequately. And that's the way this argument goes, right? So it's a really interesting argument, right? It's kind of fun going through it just to see, like, what part is it that I object to, but hopefully you're able to understanding. And if not, then please take a time to rewatch parts of this video and or read Rowe's argument. All right, for next lecture, we will talk about the problem of evil. Thank you for watching.